$40,000. That's what my grandfather poured into what he believed would be the last great adventure of his life. He sold the only treasure he had left, a small fishing boat he had built with his own hands decades ago, a boat that carried his sweat, his calloused palms, and the scent of the Oregon Sea. He should have been rewarded with joy, with memories, with laughter echoing across a deck somewhere in Japan. Instead, that sacrifice became the seed of something else. Something none of us could see coming the day he handed over the check. My name is Ethan Reed, and I was 25 when this all began. I had just finished college, unsure of my next step, caught between the pull of family duty and the urge to find my own way. But if there was one constant in my life, it was my grandfather, Samuel Reed. At 74, he wasn't just a man who had aged with dignity. He was a retired sailor whose stories were stitched into the fabric of every tide that rolled onto our small coastal town. People still called him Captain Sam, though he hadn't commanded a vessel in decades. He lived quietly in a weather-beaten cottage not far from the docks, his window always open to the sound of gulls and waves. When my mother Linda announced a luxury cruise through Japan, an odyssey of cherry blossoms, ancient shrines, and neon city lights, Grandpa's eyes lit up brighter than I'd ever seen. For a man who had spent his life sailing close to shore, never venturing beyond American waters, the idea of Japan was nothing short of a miracle. He said it like a boy making a wish. Just once, I want to see the world beyond the horizon. But dreams cost money, and Grandpa had little. His pension barely covered groceries, and the repairs on his cottage piled up year after year. Yet when Linda told him the ticket was $40,000, he didn't flinch. He spent nights at the kitchen table with a calculator scrawling numbers on scrap paper, and at last made the hardest choice of his life. He sold his boat, the vessel he had sanded, varnished, and christened with a bottle of cheap champagne the year my grandmother died. When the buyer towed it away, I saw his shoulders stiffen, like a man trying not to look back at a part of himself being dragged down the road. Still, he smiled when he handed Linda the envelope. "Here," he said softly, pressing it into her palm. "This is everything. Make sure my seat is next to the window. I want to see the ocean when the sun comes up." She kissed his cheek, but her eyes slid away too quickly, as though the weight of his hope was something she didn't want to carry. Later that evening, our neighbor Mr. Collins, an old fisherman with a voice like gravel, stopped by. He leaned close to me when Grandpa wasn't listening. "Ethan, I don't trust the way your mama talks about this trip. Watch out for him. He's given up more than she knows. I brushed it off at the time. After all, how could a man who had given everything for his family ever be left behind? I had no idea how quickly that question would find its answer. The morning of departure came draped in salt air and gull cries. We wheeled our luggage down the worn wooden planks of the harbor, the cruise ship towering ahead of us like a floating city. Its decks gleamed in the sunlight, banners fluttered in the wind, and passengers in bright clothes snapped photos as though joy itself were contagious. Grandpa Samuel wore his pressed white shirt, the one he'd saved for special occasions, and a navy cap that shadowed his tired but eager eyes. He clutched his boarding papers like they were proof of his right to dream. I walked beside him, steadying his steps over the uneven boards. My mother Linda led the way, heels clicking sharply against the dock. Marcus trailing behind her in silence. Sophie already holding her phone high to capture a selfie with the ship in the background. For a moment, it almost felt like we were the picture of a perfect family. But then Linda stopped abruptly at the check-in gate. "Dad," she said flatly, not even turning fully toward him. "You don't have a ticket. You'll have to go home." Her words landed like a cannon blast, louder than the ship's horn in my ears. Grandpa blinked confused, then fumbled for the envelope in his pocket. His hands trembled as he pulled out the receipt, the proof of $40,000 of sacrifices no one else had made. He held it out, his voice cracking. "Linda, I paid. I sold the boat. Here, it's all here." The young crew member at the gate glanced nervously from Samuel to Linda, his polite smile faltering. He reached for the paper, but Linda stepped between them, her arm outstretched like a barrier. "It doesn't matter. He's not coming. He'll slow us down." Marcus shifted uneasily, his jaw tight, eyes locked on the floorboards. Not one word left his lips. Sophie sighed loudly, rolling her eyes. "Mom, we're going to miss boarding. Just let's go already." I watched my grandfather shrink in front of them, his shoulders folding inward, his dignity unraveling before strangers. The crew member hesitated clearly, uncomfortable, his voice small. "Ma'am, if he has proof of purchase." Perhaps. Linda cut him off with a glare sharp enough to slice through rope. I said he doesn't belong here. Her tone was low, but lethal, rehearsed in a way that told me this was no accident. Grandpa's hand shook so violently the receipt slipped, fluttering down onto the dock like a leaf in the wind. He bent to pick it up, his knees creaking, his breath ragged. When he stood again, his eyes were wet. His lips pressed thin as he whispered, "All I wanted was to see the sea one last time with my family." Around us, other passengers turned to stare. A woman in a sun hat gasped. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, asking why the old man was crying. And in that public silence, with shame burning his face red, my grandfather was no longer Captain Sam Sailor of the Oregon coast. He was just a broken man being sent home from his own dream. Something inside me snapped, though my voice stayed locked in my chest for the moment. I stared at my mother, at her cold certainty, and realized Mr. Collins had been right. This wasn't carelessness. It was betrayal, carefully planned. And it was the moment I knew I would not stand quietly by. For a few heartbeats, I stood frozen, my fists clenched at my sides, my throat burning with words I hadn't yet dared to speak. Grandpa's humiliation hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, while my mother's voice cut clean through it, final, sharp, merciless. The ship's horn wailed in the distance, calling passengers aboard, yet I heard nothing but the sound of my grandfather's shallow breaths. I looked at him, his cap tilted forward to shield his eyes, his fingers gripping the wrinkled receipt as though it were the last rope, keeping him tethered to hope. He had given everything, and they had stripped him bare in front of strangers. Something inside me broke wide open. I could no longer stand by pretending silence was loyalty. "Then, I'm not going," I said, my voice carrying further than I intended. The words startled even me, but once spoken they felt immovable, like stones dropped into deep water. Linda spun around, her eyes narrowing. "What did you just say?" I stepped closer to Grandpa, sliding the strap of his bag over my shoulder. "If he's not welcome, neither am I." Her lips curled into disbelief, then rage. "Ethan, don't you dare throw away this opportunity. Do you have any idea what you're giving up Japan, the chance of a lifetime gone, because you're choosing to babysit an old man who can barely walk a dock?" The crowd around us shifted, whispering. The young crew member lowered his gaze, too uncomfortable to intervene. Sophie groaned, stamping her foot. "You're insane. You're going to ruin this for all of us." But I wasn't insane. For the first time, I was awake. "He's not just an old man," I said, my voice rising, steady and fierce. "He's my grandfather, the one who taught me how to fish, who stayed up all night when I was sick, who never once let me down. And you think I'll abandon him so you can sip cocktails on a deck and post pictures for people who don't care? Not a chance." Linda's face flushed crimson. She stepped closer, her words hissing like steam. "If you walk away with him now, Ethan don't bother coming back. You'll have no home to return to." The ultimatum hung heavy between us, sharper than any blade. For a moment fear crept in, fear of losing the roof over my head, the family I had known, the security of belonging. But then I looked at Grandpa. His eyes brimming with tears, he tried to blink away, and I knew the truth. Home wasn't the house Linda ruled like a fortress. Home was the man who had always opened his door, no matter how small, no matter how worn, with arms wide enough to carry me through storms. I took his hand. "Come on, Grandpa. We're leaving." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Linda's voice chased after me, sharp and venomous. "You'll regret this, Ethan. You'll regret it for the rest of your life." But as we stepped away from the dock, the roar of the ocean beneath us, I felt lighter than I ever had. For the first time, I wasn't walking away in shame. I was walking toward something true. We walked away from the dock with nothing but his worn duffel bag and my stubborn resolve. The voices behind us faded, the boarding calls, the laughter of tourists, even my mother's furious words. What remained was the rhythm of the waves slapping against the pier, steady and endless, as if the ocean itself had decided to bear witness to our exile. That night we rented a small room above a weathered diner on the edge of town. The walls were thin, the mattress sagged in the middle, and the window rattled when the wind blew in from the Pacific. But when Grandpa set his cap on the nightstand and lowered himself into the chair by the window, he smiled faintly, as though he had just stepped into a palace. "You didn't have to do this for me," he murmured. I pulled a chair beside him and answered, "I couldn't have done anything else." The days that followed became our own kind of voyage. Without the grandeur of Japan, we pieced together adventures from the simple gifts around us. One morning, we rented a small fishing skiff from a man down at the marina. The boat creaked with every wave, but when Grandpa held the rod in his hands, his posture straightened, his eyes sharpened. For a few hours, he wasn't a discarded old man. He was Captain Sam again, the tide bending to his command. He laughed so hard when I nearly toppled over trying to reel in a stubborn fish that tears streamed down his face, washing away some of the shame he had carried from the dock. Another afternoon, we wandered into the annual harbor festival. The streets were strung with lanterns, music spilled from fiddles and guitars, and the air smelled of roasted corn and saltwater taffy. Children darted past us with painted faces, while couples danced barefoot on the boards of the pier. Grandpa bought a paper cone of kettle corn, and with a mischievous grin tossed a handful at the gulls circling overhead. Their frenzied swoops made him laugh until his shoulders shook, and I realized I hadn't seen him that alive in years. At night he sat with his old leather logbook, the one he once used to track tides and winds. Now he filled its pages with sketches of festival lights, descriptions of the meals we ate, fragments of conversations we shared. One evening, he handed the journal to me, his handwriting scrawled but steady. "This journey is worth more than any cruise ship. The sea has never felt closer." It was at the festival where we first met her, Naomi, a young photographer with a camera slung across her shoulder and eyes that seemed to catch the light just as easily as her lens did. She stopped us by a booth, asking if she could photograph Grandpa in his sailor's cap against the backdrop of fluttering flags. He chuckled, bashful at first, but when she showed him the photo, he stared at it quietly, as though seeing himself with dignity restored. Naomi laughed easily, spoke kindly, and before long she was joining us for chowder at the diner, her stories weaving seamlessly into ours. What began as exile had become something richer than we expected, a voyage measured not in miles, but in moments. Moments that stitched back together the pieces of a man nearly broken at the dock. Naomi didn't fade into the background after that festival photo. If anything, she seemed to orbit closer with each passing day, as though the tide itself had pulled her into our small circle. At first it was chance encounters bumping into her at the pier, while she captured sunrise shots, or finding her perched on the dunes at twilight, her camera steady as the gulls wheeled overhead. But soon, it was intentional. She'd slide into the booth across from us at the diner, coffee in hand, and her laughter had a way of filling the spaces that once ached with silence. For me, the connection was immediate but unhurried. She spoke about her childhood near Puget Sound, how her own grandfather had sparked her love for the sea by teaching her to spot constellations over the water. When she said it, her eyes softened, and I felt something stir in me that I couldn't quite name. We traded dreams like seashells, fragile but real, hers of publishing a photo essay about coastal towns, mine of finding a life less defined by expectation and more by choice. But the true magic wasn't in how she spoke to me. It was in how she saw my grandfather. One afternoon, Naomi asked if she could photograph him again this time, not just in his cap, but in his old sailor's jacket, the one tucked away for decades in the bottom of a cedar chest. Grandpa hesitated at first, embarrassed by the thought of playing dress-up at his age. Yet when Naomi coaxed him with gentle humor, he gave in, slipping into the jacket with hands that trembled more from memory than age. The moment she raised her camera, something shifted. His back straightened, his eyes carried that old glint of command, and for a brief second he was Captain Sam again, not the humiliated man left behind at the dock. Naomi lowered the camera, smiling. "You look like the sea never left you," she said softly. Grandpa chuckled, but there was moisture in his eyes when he turned away. Later that evening he whispered to me, "She made me feel worth seeing." In that instant, I understood Naomi wasn't just documenting faces or landscapes. She was restoring pieces of dignity that life and family had chipped away. She listened to Grandpa's tales with genuine awe, not indulgence. When he spoke of storms he had weathered, she leaned forward as if the spray still clung to him. When he pointed out shifts in the tide, she scribbled notes like a student at her master's feet. The more she joined us on walks along the shore, over bowls of clam chowder, even on a rickety rowboat, the more alive Grandpa became. He laughed louder, walked farther, even teased me with the same playful spirit I thought he had lost forever. Watching him, I realized this wasn't just about companionship. It was about respect, the kind he had been denied by his own daughter, but rediscovered in the eyes of a stranger who saw him whole. And as I watched Naomi capture him against a backdrop of restless waves, I felt a quiet certainty grow inside me. Our exile from the cruise ship hadn't been the end of a journey. It had been the beginning of one we hadn't dared imagine. What began as chance encounters and quiet conversations with Naomi soon grew into something I couldn't deny. Day by day, our paths entwined, coffee runs turned into long walks by the shore. Laughter spilled into late-night talks under the stars, and what started as friendship unfolded into a love so steady, it felt like it had been waiting for us all along. Grandpa noticed before I dared to admit it. One evening, as Naomi and I carried groceries back to the little rented room, he caught my eye with a knowing smile. "Ethan," he said, his voice low but certain, "don't let this slip away. Some tides only come once." I carried those words with me like a compass. And so while my family sailed across Japan, chasing temples and city lights, I made the most reckless and the most honest decision of my life. I asked Naomi to marry me. She didn't pause. Her yes was not breathless or dramatic. It was simple, like the way the sea always returns to shore. We didn't need ballrooms or chandeliers. We had the ocean endless and unpolished, and that was enough. The ceremony took place at dusk on a quiet strip of beach where driftwood lay scattered like forgotten sculptures. Naomi wore a simple white dress that fluttered in the evening wind, her hair catching the last streaks of gold from the sinking sun. I wore a jacket borrowed from Mr. Collins, who insisted on pressing it until every crease was sharp. Grandpa stood between us, his sailor's cap tipped back, the logbook tucked under his arm like an old Bible. His voice trembled at first as he began, but soon grew strong, as though officiating our vows restored some long-lost authority in his bones. "Marriage," he said, looking at each of us in turn, "is not about grand journeys or perfect photographs. It is about weathering storms together." Mr. Collins wiped at his eyes openly, his weathered hands shaking as he clapped when we sealed our vows. The waves applauded too, rushing the shore in steady bursts, as if the ocean itself had chosen to bear witness. For a moment, the world shrank to just us three souls bound by loyalty, love, and the stubborn refusal to abandon one another. There was no champagne, no string quartet. Instead, Naomi and I shared our first dance barefoot in the sand, Grandpa humming a tune from his sailing days, and Mr. Collins laughing through his tears. When the stars blinked awake overhead, Grandpa closed his logbook and whispered, "This is better than any cruise, Ethan. They may come home with souvenirs, but tonight we made something they can never buy." It struck me then the family I thought I'd lost at the dock was reborn on that beach. And when the ship carrying my mother finally returned, it would not be me waiting with regret, it would be them arriving to a world they no longer recognized. The beach where Naomi and I exchanged vows still lingered in my mind when the day finally came. The ship returned its horn echoing across the harbor, carrying with it the family who believed they had left us behind for good. Grandpa and I stood on the porch of his cottage, Naomi's hand warm in mine, while Mr. Collins leaned against the fence, waiting like a witness summoned for testimony. Linda emerged first, her sunglasses reflecting the late afternoon sun, her designer suitcase rolling neatly behind her. Marcus followed, burdened with extra bags, his silence as heavy as ever. Sophie trailed last, phone in hand, snapping a picture before her gaze even lifted to us. For a moment they looked like victors returning from a conquest, skin sun-kissed smiles painted on the air around them, heavy with self-satisfaction. Then Linda's eyes found mine. At first her lips curled into a smug grin. "So Ethan, did you enjoy your little staycation with Dad? Babysitting must have been charming." Her words dripped with contempt, as if she had already won whatever battle she thought we were fighting. But her smirk faltered when she noticed Naomi at my side, the glint of a simple silver band on her finger. Her suitcase slipped from her grip, thudding against the porch step. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharper than the ship's whistle. I squeezed Naomi's hand and spoke clearly, each word deliberate. "This is my wife. We were married while you were gone." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the gulls crying overhead. Marcus froze mid-step, his eyes wide. Sophie gasped audibly, her phone nearly tumbling from her hands. Linda staggered back as if struck. "You did what she hissed. Married her. You've disgraced this family. You're a traitor, Ethan." Something inside me rose higher than her fury. For once, I wasn't afraid of her words. I didn't betray this family. I said, my voice steady. "You did the moment you told Grandpa he didn't belong. You threw him away like an old coat that no longer fit. I stood where you should have, and I won't apologize for it." Sophie's eyes flicked to Grandpa then, and for the first time her bravado cracked. She lowered her phone, shame flickering across her face. But it was Grandpa who broke the air apart. His voice, once silenced by humiliation, roared like the ocean itself. "No, Linda!" He thundered, his finger trembling as he pointed at her. The only betrayal here is yours. I sold my boat, gave you everything I had left, and you left me on that dock like trash. Ethan stood by me. He gave me back my dignity when you tried to take it away. Tell me who is family. Now my blood, or the one who never let go of my hand? The force of his words stunned even Marcus, who lowered his eyes, unable to meet Grandpa's gaze. The porch was silent, except for the waves pounding the shore, as if nature itself echoed the verdict. And in that silence, for the first time, Linda looked small. The weight of Grandpa's words still hung in the salt, thick air when Linda snapped her suitcase upright. Her face burned crimson, her lips trembling with words she couldn't seem to form. Then, with a sharp tug, she stormed past us into the cottage, her heels striking the porch like gunshots. Marcus followed quietly, his shoulders bowed under shame, his eyes fixed on the ground as though he hoped it might swallow him whole. Sophie lingered a moment longer, her phone clutched to her chest. For once, she didn't hide behind the screen. She looked at Grandpa, really looked, and her eyes softened. Without a word, she turned away, retreating inside. Silence settled over the porch, broken only by the gulls circling above and the rhythmic crash of waves. I glanced at Grandpa, bracing for the sorrow I expected to see. Instead, I found him standing taller, his chest rising with something I hadn't seen in years' pride. He met my gaze, and a faint smile touched his lips. "You gave me back my voice, Ethan," he said softly. "I thought I'd lost it for good." That night, Linda locked herself in her old room and refused to eat with us. Marcus sat at the edge of the kitchen table, head in his hands, muttering half-formed apologies he couldn't bring himself to finish. Sophie, however, slipped quietly onto the porch after dinner. She stood beside Grandpa, her hands twisting nervously. "I'm sorry," she whispered, barely louder than the waves. "I should have said something at the dock. I didn't know how." Grandpa placed a trembling hand on her shoulder, his forgiveness immediate, his eyes wet with both hurt and relief. In the weeks that followed, life reshaped itself around something gentler, truer. Naomi and I moved into the cottage, helping Grandpa tend his garden, fixing leaky windows and painting walls that hadn't seen fresh color in decades. Mr. Collins stopped by often, always with a story and a laugh, insisting that our little household was the finest crew this side of the Pacific. Grandpa's journal, once filled with grief, began to brim with new entries, sketches of Naomi's smile notes, about Sophie's tentative steps back into his life, and reflections on the quiet dignity of second chances. There were still sharp words from Linda, still cold silences that lingered like fog, but they no longer defined us. For the first time, I realized I didn't need her approval. The family I needed was already here, the grandfather who had never let me down, the woman who saw me for who I was, and a circle of loyalty that no betrayal could break. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Grandpa sat with Naomi and me on the porch. His voice was steady, his words deliberate. "Family isn't about blood," he said, gazing at the waves. "It's about who stands beside you when the tide turns. And you two, you showed up when it mattered." I took Naomi's hand in mine, Grandpa's palm resting warmly on my shoulder, and I knew he was right. What we had built was stronger than any cruise, richer than any souvenir. We hadn't just survived betrayal, we had redefined family itself. What about you? How did this story touch your heart? Please share your feelings in the comments and let us know where in the world you're watching from. We love seeing our community from every corner of the globe. If stories like this speak to you, don't forget to subscribe to Domestic Tragedy for more powerful tales of family loyalty and truth.